He had a voice that could melt steel. Legends like Otis Redding and Teddy Pendergrass came to mind when he sang. You could feel the power rattle your chest. It shook the floorboards. But before the world heard him roar, he was just a boy trying to stay alive. Picture the humid streets of Houston, Texas. The year was 1974. Danger lurked on every corner. Gangs controlled the blocks. Sirens wailed through the night like crying mothers. It was a place where dreams usually died young. His mother saw the trouble coming. She saw the streets pulling him in. She refused to let the darkness take her son. Here is the deal. She sent him away to his grandmother to save his life. That decision sparked a fire. It created a sound that would challenge Jodeci and change R&B forever. He traded the street corners for a microphone. But gravity pulls hardest when you reach the top. We all know the group H-Town. We know the way the ladies screamed when they walked out in boots and hats. But do you know the real story of the man behind the mic? The man with a range we will never hear again. The silence was louder than the applause. November 18th, 1974, a pair of lungs took their first breath in Houston, Texas. But this was not just one baby crying, it was two. Kevin Connor arrived with his twin brother, Solomon. The world would eventually call them Dino and Shazam. But on that day, they were just two boys born into a city that wanted to swallow them whole. The heat in Houston does not just make you sweat. It sits on your shoulders like a heavy coat. It sticks your shirt to your back. In the 70s and 80s, the air was thick with humidity, but the atmosphere was heavy for another reason. Poverty covered the neighborhood like a fog. They grew up on the hard side of town. The houses were small. The paint peeled off the wood in long, dry strips. The porches sagged under the weight of too many stories. It was a place where people worked hard just to stay in the same spot. Money was tight. Food was sometimes scarce. But the danger was always free. Picture the street corner at dusk. The sun dips below the horizon. The street lights flicker on, buzzing like angry flies. This was the signal. The shadows grew long, and the predators came out to hunt. Gangs claimed the blocks. Young men stood on the corners with eyes hard like flint. They sold poison to their own neighbors. You could hear the rhythm of the neighborhood at night. It was not a happy song. It was the pop of gunfire echoing off the brick walls. It was the sound of sirens wailing like crying mothers. It was the sound of running feet on pavement. Violence was a cycle. It spun around and around, pulling young boys into its center. Kevin and Solomon were 5 years old. They played in the dirt. They chased each other around the yard. They were innocent. They did not know that the streets were already watching them. The streets are always hungry for new blood. But their mother was watching too. She stood at the window. She saw the older boys on the corner. She saw the flash of cash and the gleam of chrome. She saw the way her sons looked at them with curiosity. A mother knows when the tide is turning. She saw the attitude creeping into their walk. She heard the slang creeping into their talk. She knew how this story ends. She had seen it happen to the neighbors' kids. One day, they are playing tag. The next day, they are holding a weapon. The next day, they are gone. She refused to let the darkness take her sons. She made a choice that broke her heart to save their lives. But here's the deal. She did not just ground them. She did not just yell at them. She removed them from the equation entirely. She packed their bags. She folded their small shirts. She kissed their foreheads. She sent them away to live with their grandmother. It was an escape plan. The grandmother's house was different. It was a fortress of discipline. The chaos of the streets could not cross the threshold. There were rules here. There was order. And most importantly, there was music. Music became their new atmosphere. It replaced the sound of sirens. It replaced the pop of gunfire. Kevin and Solomon did not just listen to the radio. They studied it. They treated every song like a textbook. Music was not just a hobby for them. It was food. It was water. It was the air they breathed. They sat on the floor and listened to the giants. They heard Michael Jackson. They did not just hear the beat. They felt the precision. They closed their eyes and saw him moonwalk across the stage. They studied his breathing. They studied how he made a hiccup sound like a drum. They listened to Prince. They heard the confidence. They heard the way he could scream and whisper in the same breath. They learned that a man could be pretty and tough at the same time. They listened to Marvin Gaye. This was the most important lesson. They heard the pain in his voice. They heard the struggle. Marvin did not just sing notes, he sang his soul. He sang about what was going on in the streets. Kevin felt that pain. He knew that pain. They listened to Stevie Wonder. They heard the pure joy. They heard the complex melodies that twisted and turned like a river. The twins soaked it all up. They were sponges. They did not have fancy equipment. They did not have a recording studio with soundproof walls. They had a mirror. They stood side by side, looking at their own reflections. They opened their mouths and let it out. At first, it was just practice. They mimicked the stars. But then, something shifted. The imitation stopped. Their own sound began to emerge. Kevin opened his mouth, and something ancient came out. It was a voice that sounded like it had lived 1,000 years. It was rough, like the pavement he left behind, but smooth, like the velvet he wanted to wear. It was powerful. It rattled the windows of his grandmother's house. The rejection came early. Of course, people see two little boys, and they expect a little sound. They expect a nursery rhyme. They do not expect a storm. But the boys kept singing. They sang to the walls. They sang to the furniture. They sang until their throats burned and their chests heaved. They were forging a weapon. They were turning their pain into power. The move to their grandmother's house was supposed to just keep them alive. It was supposed to keep them away from the gangs. It was supposed to keep them out of jail. It did more than that. It created a pressure cooker. The isolation, the discipline, and the burning desire to be heard mixed together. It brewed a sound that was raw and uncut. The streets of Houston thought they had lost 2 victims. The gangs thought Kevin and Solomon had disappeared, but they were just in the lab. They were just waiting. They were building the strength to scream so loud that the whole world would have to listen. But gravity pulls hardest when you defy it. The talent was undeniable. The voice was a gift from God. But the hunger came from a place of starvation. They wanted the fame. They wanted the love. They wanted to prove that they were more than just kids from the north side of Houston. They were ready to conquer the world. But they did not know that the world hits back. They did not know that the same passion that fueled their voice would eventually burn the candle at both ends. The silence of their early years was about to break, and the noise they would make would shatter everything. The practice was over. The mirror in the grandmother's house could no longer hold them. Kevin, Solomon, and their friend Daryl Jackson were ready. They formed a group. They called themselves H-Town to honor the city that made them. But talent needs a stage. And in the early 90s, the stage was looking for something new. They packed their bags again. But this time, they were not running from danger. They were running toward destiny. They headed to Miami. They wanted to meet a man named Luther Campbell. The world knew him as Luke from the Group 2 live crew. Luke was loud. He was controversial. He was the king of Miami bass. He was not known for slow, romantic love songs. But here is the deal. Luke heard them sing. He heard the harmony. He heard the pain and the power in Kevin's voice. He signed them on the spot to Luke Records. It was an odd pairing, the bad boys of bass meeting the new kings of romance. But it was the spark that lit the fuse. The year was 1993. The radio waves were about to change. H-Town released their debut single. They called it Knockin' the Boots. Picture the summer of 93. You are driving down the street with the windows down. The heat is rising off the pavement. A car pulls up next to you. The bass rattles your rearview mirror. And then you hear that voice. It was smooth. It was pleading. It was raw. Knockin' the Boots was not just a song. It was a earthquake. It shot straight up the charts. It landed at #1 on the Billboard R&B chart. It stayed there for weeks. It crossed over to the pop charts and hit #3. The world had never heard anything quite like it. It was slow like a ballad, but it had the swagger hip-hop. Kevin, now known to the world as Dino, was the center of the storm. He did not look like the old school soul singers. He did not wear a matching suit. He did not do a synchronized dance step. He wore heavy work boots. He wore sagging jeans. He wore baseball caps. He looked like the guy standing on the corners in Houston. He looked like the danger his mother tried to save him from. But when he opened his mouth, pure honey came out. This was a revolution. Critics called it begging R&B. The men were not asking for love politely. They were on their knees. They were pleading. And the ladies went crazy for it. The album dropped next. They titled it Fever for the Flavor. It flew off the shelves. It went gold. Then it went platinum. That means over 1 million people went to the store and bought their music. Suddenly, the boys from the rough side of Houston were rich. Gravity pulls hardest when you have heavy pockets. The money poured in fast. They went from sharing a room to buying estates. They bought cars with engines that growled. They bought jewelry that flashed under the stage lights. They bought their mother a house. They moved her out of the danger zone forever. They were living the dream. They went on tour. The crowds were massive. Picture a sea of faces screaming your name. Women threw flowers on the stage. Some threw room keys. Dino stood at the front, soaking it all in. He was the heartthrob. He was the voice that made knees weak. People started to compare them to Jodeci. This was the heavyweight fight of the 90s, Jodeci versus H-Town. Both groups had the bad boy image. Both groups had incredible vocals. Both groups sang about love with a rough edge. It was a rivalry that pushed R&B into a new era. Dino was a superstar. He was on the covers of magazines. He was on television screens across America. But listen closely to the music from that time. They released a cover of a song called A Thin Line Between Love and Hate. Dino sang it with a terrifying intensity. You could hear the grit in his throat. He sang about consequences. He sang about how quickly sweet love can turn sour. He also poured his soul into a cover of Emotions. He took the high notes and stretched them out until they snapped. He sang with a hunger that money could not feed. The success was blinding. They were young kings. They had the world in the palm of their hands. They thought the party would last forever. They thought the screams would never fade. But the music industry is a beast. It demands more. It demands another hit. It demands your time. It demands your privacy. Dino was living life at full speed. He was driving fast cars. He was living the rock star lifestyle. The pressure was mounting. The schedule was grueling. While the world saw a smile, the shadows were growing. Behind the platinum plaques and the sold-out shows, real life was waiting. The streets they left behind were far away, but the chaos had found a new way in. The peak is a dangerous place to stand. The air is thin up there. It is easy to lose your balance. Dino had conquered the charts. He had conquered poverty. He had proved everyone wrong. But he was about to face a challenge that no amount of money could fix. The applause was deafening, but silence was waiting in the wings. The spotlight is a cruel lover. It warms you up, but then it leaves you cold. By the late 90s, the music business began to shift. The sweet, pleading R&B of the early decade was fading. The radio wanted something harder. They wanted hip-hop. They wanted aggression. The smooth harmonies of H-Town were fighting for airtime against a louder, faster world. Gravity was starting to pull. The screaming fans were still there, but the crowds were different. The sales slowed down. The record labels played games. This is the part of the story they do not show you in the music videos. They do not show you the long meetings with lawyers. They do not show you the fight to get paid for work you already did. Dino felt the weight of the industry. He had tasted the top of the mountain. He knew what it felt like to look down at the world. Now, he had to fight just to stay on the cliff. But Kevin Dino Connor was not a quitter. He was a survivor. Remember, this was the boy who escaped the gangs of Houston. He had a voice that could melt steel. He knew that talent does not expire, even if trends do. He went back to the lab. He focused on the music. He started working on a comeback. He wanted to reclaim the throne. He wanted to show the world that H-Town was not just a memory, they were a dynasty. But life outside the studio was moving fast too. Dino found something stronger than fame. He found love. He met a woman named Tessia Ray Wysant. She was beautiful. She was kind. She saw the man, not the celebrity. She saw Kevin, not Dino. They fell in love hard. They made plans. They talked about the future. Here is the deal. Life gave Dino a second chance at happiness. Tessia became pregnant. A new life was growing. A new chapter was about to begin. Dino was preparing to be a father again. He was preparing to be a husband. The wild days of knocking to boots were behind him. He was ready to settle down. He was ready for peace. January 28th, 2003, the day started like any other. The air in Houston was cool and damp. Dino was doing what he did best. He was in the recording studio. He was laying down tracks for the new album. The magic was still there. The voice was still powerful. He finished his session. He felt good. The music was right. The future looked bright. He walked out of the studio with Tesha. They climbed into an SUV. It was a big, strong vehicle. It felt safe. They closed the heavy doors. They shut out the noise of the city. They were in their own little bubble of happiness. They drove through the streets of Houston, the same streets that raised him, the same streets that he sang about. But the streets are unpredictable. Picture the intersection. It was dark. The streetlights painted yellow streaks on the wet pavement. Dino approached a green light. Green means go. Green means safety. But in the blink of an eye, the world turned upside down. A car coming from the other direction ignored the red light. The driver did not stop. He did not slow down. He barreled into the intersection like a missile. Physics does not care about talent. Physics does not care about fame. Physics does not care that you have a pregnant fiancé in the passenger seat. The impact was thunderous. Metal screamed against metal. Glass shattered into a million diamonds. The SUV spun. It flipped. The heavy vehicle rolled over and over on the unforgiving concrete. Then, silence. The wheels stopped spinning. The engine died. The music stopped. Sirens wailed in the distance. It was a sound Dino knew from his childhood. But this time, the sirens were coming for him. Rescuers arrived at the scene. They saw the wreckage. They saw the twisted metal. They worked fast. They pulled Tesha from the vehicle. But it was too late. She was gone. The baby was gone. The future they planned together vanished in a heartbeat. Dino was still fighting. His heart was still beating. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital. The lights flashed against the night sky. The doctors worked on him. They tried to save the voice that had touched millions. They tried to save the father. They tried to save the legend. But the damage was too deep. On the way to the hospital, or perhaps shortly after arriving, Kevin Dean O'Connor took his last breath. He was only 28 years old. The news broke the next morning. It hit the world like a physical blow. Fans woke up to the headline. They could not believe it. How could a voice so full of life be silenced so suddenly? His twin brother, Shazam, felt a pain that no one else could understand. They had shared a womb. They had shared a room. They had shared a stage. Now, one half of the soul was gone. The tragedy was absolute. There was no long sickness to say goodbye. There was no warning. 1 minute, he was a young king planning his comeback. The next minute, he was a memory. The crash site in Houston became a shrine. People left flowers. They left teddy bears. They lit candles that flickered in the wind. They played Knockin' the Boots from their car stereos. But the music sounded different now. When you listened to his voice, you did not just hear the romance anymore. You heard the ghost. You heard the tragedy. You heard the sound of a man who had everything and lost it all to a red light runner in the rain. The music industry paused. The rivalry with Jodeci did not matter anymore. The sales figures did not matter. The lawsuits did not matter. All that mattered was the empty space where a legend used to stand. The fall was not a slow decline. It was a sudden drop off the edge of the world. It was a reminder that tomorrow is promised to no one, not even to the ones with the golden voices. The studio where he recorded his final notes sat empty. The microphone was cold. The lyrics he wrote were left on a piece of paper, waiting for a singer who would never return. Houston had lost its voice. But here is the thing about legends. They die, but they do not disappear. The body was gone, buried in the Texas soil. But the sound was about to take on a life of its own. The silence was loud, but the echo was eternal. The sun rose over Houston on January 29th, 2003. But the light looked different. It looked gray. It looked cold. The news spread through the city like a fever. Headlines hit the paper stands. They used black ink on white paper. They said H-Town singer killed in crash. It looked so simple. It looked like just another statistic in a big, violent city. But the ink could not capture the sound of a mother crying. The news reports spoke about chart positions. They listed his hits like Knockin' the Boots. They treated his life like a business transaction. But the reality was much darker. The media called it a tragedy, but for the family, it was an apocalypse. Here is the deal. The world saw a celebrity pass away. They saw a star fade out. But inside the Connor home, A light had been smashed. Shazam, his twin brother, did not just lose a bandmate. He did not just lose a sibling. He lost his reflection. They had shared a womb. They had shared a bedroom. They had shared a microphone. They walked through life side by side. Now, Shazam had to walk alone. Every time he looked in a mirror, he saw the face of the brother he could not save. The hypocrisy of fame showed its ugly face that week. When Dino was alive and fighting to make a comeback, the phone did not ring often. The radio stations were busy playing the new hits. They were busy chasing the next big thing. But the moment he died, the phone would not stop ringing. Suddenly, everyone was his best friend. Radio stations that had ignored his new music put his old songs on repeat. They called it a tribute. But to those who knew him, it felt like guilt. It felt like the industry was trying to say sorry to a man who could no longer hear them. Fans gathered at the crash site. They turned the cold pavement into a garden. Picture the intersection. Broken glass still glittered on the road. But now, it was covered in flowers. Teddy bears sat against the light pole. Candles flickered in the wind, fighting to stay lit. People stood on the corner and wept. They played his music from their car stereos. The voice of Dino floated over the traffic. It sounded different now. The sexy pleading of knocking the boots sounded like a prayer. The high notes in emotions sounded like a cry for help. The public focused on the loss of a singer. But the truth was even heavier. The crash did not just take a voice. It took a father. It took a future husband. It took an unborn child. Tesha Ray Wiesent was not famous. She did not have gold records on her wall, but her life mattered just as much. She was the woman who gave Dino peace. She was the one who saw the man behind the sunglasses. The driver of the SUV who ran that red light did not just break traffic laws. He broke a lineage. He stole a generation. The music industry tried to move on. That is what the machine does. It grinds forward. New groups appeared. New singers wore the boots and the hats. They tried to copy the swagger, but you cannot copy a soul. Critics tried to analyze his legacy. They wrote articles about the H-Town sound. They talked about how the group bridged the gap between Jodeci and the hip-hop world. They used big words to explain a simple feeling, but the fans knew the truth. They knew that Dino sang for the underdogs. He sang for the boys who grew up in houses with peeling paint. He sang for the people who had to shout to be heard above the sirens. The funeral was the final concert, but there was no applause. There was only the sound of a community breaking. Gravity had finally won the physical battle. It pulled the metal SUV to the ground. It pulled the casket into the earth. But here is the thing about true power. They buried the man. They buried the body. But the voice refused to stay in the ground. The radio waves carried it up. The memories carried it forward. The media moved to the next story. The cameras turned away. But in Houston, and in headphones all over the world, the echo remained. The man was gone, but the legend was just getting started. The dirt settled on the grave. The news trucks drove away. The cameras went to find the next tragedy. But silence did not win this war. You can bury a man. You can bury a casket. But you cannot bury a sound that changed the world. Turn on the radio today. Listen closely to the R&B stations. When you hear a singer pleading for love, that is the ghost of Dino. When you hear a man not afraid to beg, that is the legacy of H-Town. Here is the truth. Kevin Dino Connor did not just sing songs. He gave permission to a generation of men. He showed them it was okay to be vulnerable. He showed them that you could be tough enough for the streets of Houston, but soft enough to cry for the woman you love. He did not need computers to fix his pitch. He did not need auto-tune to find the soul. He just opened his mouth, and the truth came out. His twin brother, Shazam, carried the torch. Imagine the strength that takes. Imagine standing on a stage with a microphone in your hand. You look to your left. You expect to see your brother. You expect to see your other half. But you see empty space. Shazam kept the group alive. He toured the world. He kept the name H-Town on the marquees. Every concert became a tribute. Every note became a memory. But the lesson of this story is not just about music. It is about the fragility of life. Dino conquered the gangs. He conquered poverty. He climbed the mountain of fame. He had the cars, the money, and the gold records. But none of that could stop a red light runner in the rain. He was only 28 years old. He left us right when he was finding his peace. He left us with a catalog of hits and a heart full of what-ifs. We will never know what songs he still had inside him. We will never hear the lullabies he would have sung to his child. But we have the recordings. We can still go back to 1993. We can press play. We can feel the humidity of a Houston summer. We can feel the bass rattle the trunk. And for a few minutes, Dino is alive again. The tragedy fades away. Only the voice remains. Picture that boy in his grandmother's house. He is singing into a mirror. He is dreaming of the world. He caught that dream. He held it tight, and he gave it to us. Some stories end without closure, but dignity doesn't need applause. Do you remember where you were when you first heard Knockin' the Boots? Do you remember the first time that voice came through your speakers? Share your memories of Dino and the H-Town era in the comments below. Let's keep the legacy loud.